head on those two things. And that's something I feel in myself. You know, any of us that have been brought up to be good kids, well-mannered, respect for other people, but with a certain expectation of a certain way of living. And sometimes that is against what your impulses are, you know, and that kind of just the constant tussle inside, I think.
We've been talking about Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth, and you're listening to A Good Read, where my guests today are Katy Brand and Nish Kumar. Nish, your good read.
Yes, I chose Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge, which spun out of a blog post that she wrote in 2014, where she felt that she had had enough of justifying her frustrations with racism to white people, and she has expanded on that blog post into a sort of state of the nation thesis about where we are with race in Britain today and the kind of roots of racial tension and how it's manifesting itself. And I met Reni because we both contributed to an anthology of essays called The Good Immigrant, which is put together by a novelist from Bristol called Nikesh Shukla. It's a book that I really have been anticipating. And sometimes when you have that sort of anticipation, and that it can be a disappointment, but when I read it, I was very gratified to see that it was not a disappointment at all. I think it's incredible, and I think one of the reasons that I think it's so incredible is it's very hard to do something that is both incredibly passionate and I also think incredibly rationally argued. Like, there's a huge amount of anger and frustration balled up in this book, but it's expressed with such clarity and with such a kind of academic rigour.
Nish, if you had to say in one sentence what the thesis of her book is, or two sentences, what would you say she's saying? Because she's not just saying, you know, there's racism in Britain, it's not a good thing.
No, that's right. She's saying that there are systemic issues with race that we have failed to confront over the last sort of 25 to 30 years. And I think that this book is an attempt to jar us out of complacency. Because I think certainly sort of growing up in the 1990s, growing up as a non-white person in the 90s, you were constantly being told, oh, it's fine. You know, it's fine. Goodness gracious me, he's on the television. Lenny Henry's very famous. It's fine. We've gone beyond these kind of arguments. And then, strangely enough, really after Obama was elected president, we were told that we'd all moved into a kind of post-racial utopia. And the only positive thing that I can take from the sort of upswing in hate crime in the aftermath of the EU referendum is that we don't have to pretend that there isn't an issue anymore, because we have sort of hard proof, and this book couldn't be more timely.
Katy Brand, as a white person to whom Reni Eddo-Lodge says she's no longer talking.
I really enjoyed this book. The first part of the book is the original blog that she wrote a few years ago, which is a real punch to the gut. I mean, I found that it's so full of controlled fury. And it was quite a strange experience to begin a book where the author has sort of already told you, I'm very angry with you and I don't want to speak to you about this. It's your turn to listen. So you begin the book as a white person, as a white woman, thinking, okay, the author of this book is very angry with me. She has every reason to be angry with me. She told me she's very angry with me, and I'm nonetheless going to read it. And not be frightened off by that, or pull away, or try and avoid the confrontation, or look away, and to continue with it. And I loved it. I'm glad, you know, that it was put in front of me to read it. It could well be something I would have read anyway, but the history section at the beginning is just brilliant and mind-blowing.
This is a history of race relations and race in Britain, going back to the Atlantic slave trade.
And she makes the point, absolutely rightly, which has never properly occurred to me before, that we don't study it in this country. She makes the point herself that when she began writing the book, she knew more about African-American civil rights movement than anything about the UK. And the kind of potted history of race relations in the UK that she gives us in the first chapter, that she's researched herself, is just brilliant and incredibly valuable as a resource. I mean, she's absolutely right to say, for me it was, I knew about Windrush, I knew about Enoch Powell, I knew about Brixton and Toxteth, and I knew about the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and that's it. And it's actually shocking that we're not taught any of these things in schools.
Yeah.
So even just as an academic beginning to it, and then she moves into more of her thesis and her views on structural racism and the urgency of the problem, and white people needing to confront white privilege and the systemic bias towards white people.
Do you think it has changed your attitude? Because I have to say, I opened this book feeling very defensive, like, oi, what have I done wrong? I was won over by two things. One is that clearly she is continuing to talk to white people about race, because that is what this book is. But also by the fact that it seemed to me that she was very clear about her central thesis, which is this idea that white people do not think about race because their race is the privileged one, and they are the norm, and it's black people who have to think, or people of colour who have to think about race, and that they need to think about it. They need to recognise the poorest white person has the privilege of not being the poorest black person, and also to recognise that a privileged one set of people must come at a cost to another set of people. Now that's, it seems to me, is the message that I thought was very clear and irrefutable. But I wasn't quite sure, and I'm interested to hear from you, Katy. Do you feel that it's changed you reading the book? Do you feel that you're going to be any different? Because presumably you wouldn't have considered yourself a racist anyway.
No, I don't. But then, someone else might disagree with me. I don't consider myself racist. But what it has done for me is brought it into focus, the issue. I think I feel more aware, more educated, and more focused on it, and I have more of a sense of the urgency of the problem. The people, the children, particularly, and students and young people in this country who are not white, who have brilliant potential, who just simply because of that are not going to get the right opportunities to achieve it, and that is a burning injustice, and I think it's a problem for the human species. We need all the help we can get.
This sort of sense of awareness of my privilege, of Katy's privilege through being white, clearly it is not news to you that white people have a privilege.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, what for you in this book was new?
I thought that I think, like a lot of the best pieces of writing, it had a way of articulating ideas that you might have felt beneath the surface but never quite been able to put into words, and it's the sort of academic clarity that I really appreciate about this book, because when it's a subject like race that's so personal to me, I really struggle sometimes to express myself clearly, because I find myself sort of clouded by emotion and anger. And what I loved about this was, like, I've certainly conversationally in the past used a term like white privilege without ever really engaging with what it means. There isn't a term or a hypothesis posited in this book that she doesn't, in sort of rigorous detail, examine and justify. For me, the element of this book that I really clutch close to my heart is the ability to articulate and, in sort of academic detail, explain why I am upset about certain things.
Can I just say, in case the word academic repeated is making people think I do not want to read this book, it is also occasionally very funny despite the anger.
It's
and also
very funny, yeah.
Full of anecdotes. She does a very good anecdote in order to differentiate between racism and prejudice. She says, sure, we are all prejudiced. And she talks about going into a takeaway Caribbean food shop, and the guy serving, who is from the Caribbean or of Caribbean descent, waits till everybody else has gone and then gives her saving and says, I keep the best bit for people like us. And she says, yes, the guy is prejudiced, but this is not racism. He can affect nothing except people's lunch.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's that idea that racism is prejudice plus power.
And there's a kind of clarity of expression that means that as a 32-year-old, I absolutely adored it. But a part of me is thinking, I really wish I could have given this to my sort of 14, 15-year-old self.
We've been talking about Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. and onto my good read now, which is a collection of poetry called A Scatter